The world police. It's a bit of a tongue-in-cheek term thrown around to deride the US, but does the world actually need one strong, capable leader? Without it, is there chaos or greater global cooperation? The rise of China, coupled with President Trump's America First policy, has thrown the current world order off balance. So, are we witnessing a changing of the guard? It's up for debate here on Counterpoints with me, Melinda Nucifora. Since retaking the White House, President Donald Trump has made some bold and seemingly irrational moves, upending the global trading system, openly criticising Ukraine and re-engaging with Russia, and even threatening to take Greenland by force. They may appear unrelated, but there is one common thread.
China. China.
China.
China.
China.
China.
China.
China.
China.
China. China.
China wants to make a deal.
China is the biggest threat to the US as the dominant superpower since the Soviet Union. China's GDP is projected to reach $25 trillion by 2030, second only to the US. America has a larger defence budget, but China's manufacturing capabilities are unrivaled. And then there's China's pragmatism. Unlike previous US administrations, China's global alliances and deals aren't underpinned by ideology. It boasts win-win deals to build highways, high-speed rail lines and other critical infrastructure without becoming embroiled in domestic conflicts, regime change or multi-trillion-dollar wars. Today on Counterpoints, we'll debate if Trump's actions show the US has accepted that China is a real threat to its dominance. What will determine global dominance in the future? And how will the US-China competition affect global conflicts? Welcome to Counterpoints on Al Arabiya English. Joining our panel on the current US-China standoff and its repercussions globally is Elliot Abrams, Distinguished National Security Advisor, who has served Republican US presidents from Ronald Reagan to Donald Trump, and Dr. Victor Gao, the Vice President of the Beijing-based Center for China and Globalization. Gentlemen, welcome to Counterpoints. Now, leaders from both the US and China have referred to their relationship with each other as one of the most consequential bilateral relationships in the world. For years, their interconnectedness has allowed both countries to prosper, but recent developments suggest that period is over. Victor, let me start with you. Do you think that recent actions by the Trump administration has revealed what America maybe hasn't admitted for a long time, that it is really concerned by China's rise and perhaps considers it a threat to its global dominance?
Thank you very much for having me. First of all, China's rise is inevitable. No one can stop it. The United States cannot stop it. That's the mega trend. Secondly, this trade war launched by President Trump and his government against the whole world, including China, is the wrong war. And it's not constructive. It throws all the rules of the game out of the window. It damages the free trade. And while different countries need to come up with strategies, how do they want to deal with the United States in this manhandling of mankind, China has decided to rise up to the occasion and strongly defend the free trade. China will fight to the end, as the government has declared, and China has now imposed the retaliatory tariff up to 125% against all U.S. exports to China. Now, if things are not handled well, this means complete stop of China-U.S. trade, both ways. No goods exported from the United States to China, and complete stop of everything made in China to the United States. This is decoupling. If the United States wants to really welcome this, China will reciprocate. And causing the breakup of China-US relations. Whether this will evolve from peace to war, well, let's all be prepared. In essence, what China now declares is that it is prepared to fight to the end. Trade war, tariff war, technology war, or real war. So the ball is in Trump's court. You decide, and I will reciprocate. I will never succumb to the US pressure. And this is the moment of truth. China wants to defend free trade. The United States wants to destroy free trade.
Right.
The rest of the world is watching, and there will be a choice by the end of the day.
Elliot, if we look beyond the trade war onto global dominance in general, do you agree with what Dr. Gao is saying, that China's rise is inevitable and it's unstoppable?
First, thank you for having me. China's rise is inevitable. China's belligerency, and you just heard some of that belligerency, I would have thought is not inevitable. Maybe it is under Xi Jinping. But the problem that the United States has with China is not its rise, it is China's conduct. First of all, China, from the day it joined the World Trade Organization, has never believed in free trade, and it has not practiced free trade. It has taken advantage of the WTO to build up its own economy at the expense of other economies, and it has used its power to threaten neighbors. For example, the Philippines. That's just one very good example. Or Vietnam, there's another example. Or Taiwan, there's another example. The problem is not China's rise, which I agree is inevitable, and which ought to favor the people of China and really the people of the whole world. But it isn't doing so because of the way China is actually conducting itself.
Could the same be argued, though, about the US? When we talk about conduct, a lot of the US's allies would argue that perhaps the US's conduct doesn't represent that of a global leader anymore either.
Well, I wouldn't defend every single thing that President Trump has done. But I think if you look at the Philippines as a good example. There was a point at which the United States had bases in the Philippines. The Philippines told us, you should leave. So we left. Now, the Philippines being threatened by China, the Philippines is asking us to help with their defense. So we're helping. I think that's the way a friend should behave. Now, when it comes to tariffs, I think what President Trump is really saying is, look, China wants to manufacture every single thing that people are buying in the world and slowly but surely hollow out their own manufacturing. It isn't just the US that is saying that's not acceptable. I think you'll increasingly find the Europeans saying that that's not acceptable either. So I think what President Trump is trying to do is to say that unfair trade practices are not going to be permitted. Now, Victor says he wants free trade. I don't really think we've seen free trade on the part of China over the last couple of decades recently, and particularly under Xi Jinping.
Victor, would you like to respond to that? Is China interested in free trade?
2 points. With due respect to the distinguished American panelist, the Philippines. Allow me to announce it for the record. To have U.S. operating military bases in the Philippines today is against the Philippine Constitution. So you are engaged in illegal activity in the Philippines according to the explicit provisions of the Filipino Constitution. So my advice is go to check out the Filipino Constitution and see whether your operation in the Philippines is legal or not. Secondly, it's very evident that the United States wants to turn the Philippines into a proxy and even wants to go far to provoke some conflict between China and the Philippines so that it can benefit its geopolitical ambitions against China. This is a very explicit game plan. We can see it very clearly. The Filipino boundary is well demarcated by the Spanish-American Treaty, 1898. Everything that belonged to the Philippines was handed over by the Spanish Empire to the United States. It was, again, very much declared, very clearly defined when Japan surrendered. Everything belonging to the Philippines was handed over by the Japanese occupier to General MacArthur. So anything which was not in the U.S.-Spanish Treaty of 1898 did not belong to the Philippines. Anything that Japan did not surrender back to the United States did not belong to the Philippines. We do not need to go back to the Congressional Library in Washington or the Naval Archive.
I think we may have lost Victor Gao there for a moment. We'll re-establish that connection and go to you, Elliot Abrams. What do you think about China's activities in the South China Sea? Is this an example of where the US can exert its dominance as a superpower when we talk about global dominance maybe in terms of defense budgets and military capabilities?
Well, the United States is not seeking global dominance. It is seeking to help people who are near China, who fear this new China. Who do I mean? Everybody. I mean, Taiwan, Japan, Australia, Vietnam, South Korea. You can just look at the map. Really, all of China's neighbors now fear its effort to dominate first the South China Sea and the first island chain, so-called, and then all of Asia. And the United States, sure, we're responding because in some cases we have defense treaties. In other cases, we have friendship. I mean, in the case of the Philippines, we had bases, we gave up the bases. Now the Philippines wants help from the United States in defending itself. But so do really all of China's neighbors, except perhaps North Korea, which is a sort of more or less ally of China. So I think the problem here is, go ahead, yeah.
Well, I just was going to ask, that's all well and good if we consider perhaps previous US administrations, even Republican administrations, who had very active foreign policy interventions. Donald Trump, the current US president, seems more keen on domestic focus, America first. So is the US relinquishing their rights and responsibilities as a global leader? They can't complain when someone else steps in.
Well, first of all, this behavior on the part of China, to which I was referring, which belligerent behavior, I would call it, that has led so many of its neighbors to fear it, has been growing slowly but steadily over the last, well, 15 years, let's say, really since Xi Jinping took over. So it has nothing to do with Donald Trump. It is true that President Trump would like to be able to concentrate more and more on the American economy. But what does that mean? For one thing, it means dealing with China and trade with China. It means dealing with the fact that most Americans, and this is really bipartisan, most Americans have come to the conclusion that China today, under Xi Jinping, is a greatly expansionist military and economic power that is trying to achieve dominance first in Asia, but then outside of Asia. So I wouldn't focus too much on the Trump administration. And in fact, to the extent that we want to, Trump has made it very clear that his main concern outside the United States is China. That's why the tariff policy is focused so much on China rather than, for example, on Europe.
Do you think then that it is realistic that we are moving away from a unipolar superpower system where we have the US at the top to maybe a point in the near future where the US and China are going to be sharing and competing equally for global dominance, more of a multipolar view?
Well, yes, in the sense that there was a kind of unipolar moment at the end of the Cold War when the Soviet Union collapsed. And that's, what, 35 years ago now. And in those 35 years, China has invested a great deal in its military, vast expansion of its military, in an effort to rival the United States as a superpower. So I think that's right. I think we're in a place where there is no unipolar leadership by the United States. The question is, what kind of global power, what kind of superpower will China be? And I think an awful lot of its neighbors are telling us all that it is a pretty belligerent superpower and that they're afraid of it.
Is competition, though, in terms of global dominance, for want of a better phrase, a good thing? Is it about time that the US needs to accept that it doesn't act alone and in a vacuum?
Well, I don't think the United States ever really wanted that kind of global dominance, unipolar systems. But when you say, is it about time? I mean, the question really, I'd say two questions. One, what are the facts? And the facts are that China, from a military and economic point of view, has been rising steadily over the last couple of decades, or actually several decades economically, since really the arrival of Deng Xiaoping. And that is an inevitability. What is not inevitable is, how does this newly powerful China behave economically and militarily? Does it threaten its neighbors? Does it use its economic power to dominate other countries? Does it, for example, does it try to dump massive amounts of manufactured goods on other countries and thereby hollow out their own manufacturing capabilities? A lot of Americans would tell you that's the kind of thing that happened here. And there are a lot of other countries, I think, that are afraid of it. And I think you're going to see more tariffs on China, particularly with the US tariffs preventing some manufactured goods from coming here. There's a great fear, I think, that China will be targeting other economies and trying to move out its manufacturing there, because the fact is they've overbuilt their manufacturing capacity. They have much more capacity than they need to serve the people of China.
Okay, we're going to move on to our second segment about what global dominance looks like. And I see we can welcome back Dr. Victor Gao. Thanks for rejoining us. I apologize for that slight technical glitch. Let's move on to our second sort of segment of our debate. The US under Donald Trump has pursued a more perhaps realist foreign policy. He's interested in doing business with countries rather than lecturing them on how they should govern. So this is something we've been seeing from China in their dealings with foreign countries for quite a long time. So Dr. Gao, let's go straight to you. Is the US under so much pressure from China that now they're taking a play directly out of China's playbook and operating on the world stage the way China has been?
Well, first of all, doing business is fine, but doing business by holding a gun at your head is not acceptable. Not to China, probably not to everyone else. Different countries may have different views about what the United States is doing, and it wants to tailor-make its response accordingly. That's fine. But for China, you cannot hold a gun to China's head and issue ultimatum and demand all the impossibilities, for example, and ask China to swallow that. China is the country that values dignity and decency and honor more than economic gains or economic losses. So if you want to hold a gun at China's head, China will hold a gun at your head. If you want to strike China in the cheek, China will strike you back. That's the decision and the determination of the Chinese nation. This is not belligerency. This is the minimum decency you need to apply to international relations. How can you demand other countries, I will slap you in the face, don't slap me back, otherwise I will punish you more? That's the law of the jungle.
But does China really have the power to be that sort of bold against the US? They have a much bigger defense budget.
Let me assure you one thing. I studied arms control and deterrence at Yale graduate school political science department, by today, China and the United States can both destroy each other and cause Armageddon for mankind. China wants to pursue peace. The United States is advocating for war, tariff war, trade war, technology war, talent war, and possibly a perverse version of the proxy war or Cold War or hot war. China wants to promote peace of all kinds. Now, for your benefit, China is the largest trading partner with more than 140 countries in the world. Can you believe it? We've dealt with countries of all kinds, different sizes, different conditions, and we treat them equal, big or small. And China wants to pursue peace. China wants to be the barrier, standard barrier of free trade. Now that the United States abandons free trade and uses bullying and intimidation to force other countries to follow its line of thinking. No, this is not what China wants to do, and China will not accept that.
Elliot?
This is the moment of truth. Who is the standard barrier of free trade?
Go ahead.
I would say that China does not practice free trade. It is not, and it has never been, the standard bearer for free trade. For example, free trade would not permit the massive theft of intellectual property in which China has been engaging for decades and is still engaging today. That's not part of free trade. The United States, as you should know, under President Trump, above all, wants to avoid war. He is currently engaged in an effort to bring the war in Ukraine to an end, to bring the war in Gaza to an end. A negotiation with Iran has just commenced. So the last thing President Trump wants is foreign wars. But what he is doing is, to begin with, protecting the American economy. And that's not a declaration of war. That is an effort which I think any government would undertake to protect its own people and its own economy from practices that, in his words, have robbed the American people and the American economy over the last few decades. So I think Dr. Cao has been quite belligerent in his rhetoric. I'm not entirely sure why. Donald Trump is not threatening war against China. But the United States does have some treaties with Japan, for example, defense treaties. And we're not prepared to see China run roughshod over the rights of all of its neighbors.
Dr. Gao, the US may not be declaring war on China, but Vice President J.D. Vance recently said, to make it a little more crystal clear, I'm quoting here, we borrow money from Chinese peasants to buy the things those Chinese peasants manufacture. So it's maybe not a declaration of war, but it's certainly not a show of respect to another global leader. Is this how a world superpower should behave?
Well, J.D. Vance and I went to the same law school, Yale Law School. I was 20 years ahead of him. I'm ashamed by what J.D. Vance said, because he kept talking about the Chinese peasants, etc. Let me make the simple point. The urban population in China is about 3 times as big as the total population in the United States. The middle class in China is more than the total number of the people in the United States. So if J.D. Vance comes to China, he could barely find a peasant at all, because he will see the urban population. And by today, China is one of the leading industrialized nations in the world. Now, talking about intellectual property, let me emphasize one point very briefly. China now has more patent approved every year than the United States. China is a leading nation of protecting IPR. So no more use those misinformation or mislabeling to describe China. China is a fierce defender of the intellectual property rights for its own good, for mankind's good. And the United States has accused China of intellectual theft for something which it does not even have. And Huawei now has more powerful intellectual property rights, creating more wonderful, miraculous products than anything that the United States can dream about. So if you want to talk about RPR, we can spend an hour talking about RPR, but let's talk back about this trade war. The trade war launched by Trump is wrong. It's the wrong war. It's the war against mankind.
Right.
China is fighting back And China views this the moment of defending open trade and free trade. Lighthizer even said, no trade is free. That means his mind and his soul are not free. He's suffering from demons. He's suffering from all these ulterior motivations. In China, we advocate free trade. China is the largest trading partner with more than 140 countries in the world. This is a convincing evidence that by practicing free trade, China is number one in terms of international trade with the rest of the world.
Okay, I can see by your face there, Mr. Abrams, that you want to respond.
Well, I just don't think, these statements are persuasive. China protects intellectual property rights for China. It doesn't respect intellectual property rights for others. In fact, most frequently, it tells companies that want to do business in China that they must hand over intellectual property rights. And then what the Chinese do is copy the product and then produce it in massive volumes so as to put that original company under enormous economic pressure. But again, I guess I'm not surprised, but I'm struck by the rhetoric that Dr. Gao is using, which is a rhetoric of war, 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 which is, again, the last thing the United States or Donald Trump, President Trump, wants. But this is, I think, this is indicative of the kind of wolf warrior diplomacy, as it's called, that Xi Jinping's China has adopted. And it is exactly that to which the United States is responding.
We were talking there about intellectual property. So let me ask you both this. What will determine global dominance in the future? It was simply currently or in the past the size of a country's defense budget. If you had big military, you were a big superpower. Will that change? Is it going to be R&D, innovation, AI? I'll ask you, Mr. Abrams, first. Will that play a greater role in the future? Maybe not overtake defense, but is it going to be more important in maintaining global dominance?
I think so. I wouldn't use the term global dominance, but I would use the term economic and military power. Both are much more linked now to high tech. We began to see that in the war in Iraq, which is, 20 years ago now. And we see more of it with artificial intelligence. And I think you can't find a military analyst today who would not say that tomorrow's military power is greatly linked not just to the industrial plant of a country, but to the highest levels of technological advancement. I think that is true.
And what about you, Dr. Gao? I mean, the US still has a bigger military budget. Is China looking at innovation, at artificial intelligence as a way it can counter perhaps what it doesn't have in tanks and missiles?
Well, talking about the military budget, the US military budget is larger than the next 10 countries' military budget combined together. So the United States has a lot of military budget, a lot of equipment, etc. That's for sure. Now, the point I want to make is that if you can destroy the world 1,000 times versus, for example, if you can have the world destroyed 10 times, there is not a lot of difference. Now, in the world of nuclear age, mutually assured destruction is the rule of the game. Between China and the United States, they have already reached mutually assured destruction if any country wants to use war as an instrument to achieve its geopolitical goals. Both China and the United States can destroy each other multiple times, regardless of whether the United States has a larger budget or otherwise. Therefore, from the Chinese view, the world in the future, according to my personal dream, for example, should be a world of peace. A world every country will be treated equal. Every country respects each other, and no country will be allowed to dominate against any other country. MAGA, or Make America Great Again, is fine, but you cannot achieve that at the expense of other countries. You cannot achieve your greatness by belittling, by delegating or relegating other countries to the lowest echelon of the hierarchy. Every country has its ambition. Every country wants to be in the first front, first row, for example, and no country should be allowed to trample rules of free trade, to trample international order, and to dictate to others, to issue ultimatum, to hold a gun at your head, to demand submission to my will. This is the law of the jungle, and China will never have a part of that, and China will fight to death to oppose that.
Before we move on,
Well,
Mr.
you know,
Abrams,
it's interesting. Can I just say, yeah, if that were the policy of China, then first, China would not be massively expanding its nuclear weapons, which the United States is not doing, but China is. It seems to want to be able to destroy the world over 10 times, 50 times, 100 times. Secondly, China would not be massively expanding its conventional strength, which won't really have any effect on the United States and our nuclear standoff. The purpose of that is to intimidate neighbors.
All right, well, we sort of are linking in. Oh, go ahead.
Can I add a point? Everyone knows that the United States has the largest, if not one of the two largest nuclear arsenals in the world, and China's warheads added up together only account for a fraction of that of the United States. That's number one. Number two, in terms of conventional weapons, China is a complete match against the United States. And China does not want to look at its neighboring country. We have 14 land neighboring country. We have 6 maritime neighboring country. No one is a match against China. China's military buildup, if it is real, is basically to prevent the United States using war as an instrument, try to surprise China and try to wrestle China down, or to delay China, to derail China's peaceful rise. That's the only purpose. China is making sure that the American gets the message. If you want to impose war on China, you get war. If you want to destroy China, you get destroyed. If you want to bomb China out with nuclear weapons, you will be wiped out with nuclear weapons. That's the mutually assured destruction theory, mad theory, that everyone in Pentagon, everyone in Washington, D.C. should fully know about. China is not going to be pushed around, and China will fight to the end, one way or another, peacefully or otherwise. So the choice is in Washington. China wants to be a partner of the United States, rather than being a slave of the United States or being a subordinate of the United States.
Jesus.
Trump said one thing.
Does that sound like the words of a partner, Mr. Abrams?
No. I mean, again, the belligerence of this rhetoric, war and attacks and nuclear war, it's really quite striking. About the United States bombing China, I'm not quite sure where this is coming from. Well, it's coming from Beijing. And it is this kind of rhetoric, but more importantly, this kind of policy that has led the United States and others to be fearful of the direction in which Xi Jinping is taking China.
Well, we are talking a lot about conflict, even though we've been hearing that China wants peace, the US wants peace. The Cold War was obviously one of the arguably most dangerous periods in history, with 2 nuclear powers hovering their fingers over the big red buttons. And now it sounds like there's an allusion to maybe the same period happening now. Elliot, do you think that we are actually heading to a turbulent period of conflict because of this US-China competition, or is this just bluster?
Well, I think it's more than bluster. I think we're seeing actually Chinese actions in the South China Sea. We're seeing actual preparations for an invasion of Taiwan. We're seeing China taking territory maritime territory that belongs to others, that is in their economic zones. So I think it's more than just bluster, and I do think it's dangerous. I think this is not what the Chinese people want, but it is the policy of the Communist Party and of Xi Jinping. So yes, I think we are in for a period of greater danger for all of those who are neighbors of China and for the United States. And why? Well, we see it in this kind of remarkably belligerent tone that Victor Gao is taking.
Dr. Gao, do you want to respond? Is this a period as dangerous as the Cold War?
Well, first of all, since the end of the Cold War in 1991, how many wars has the United States been involved? The world knows. If the Americans pretend not to know, the world knows. How many wars has China been involved in? Zero. Let me emphasize, zero. This is the track record of China defending peace. And that is the track record of the United States being involved in war after war after war. So I think while the American policymakers in Washington may pretend that they don't know the truth, mankind as a whole knows about the truth. They know China today is the most important stabilizing force in the world. Washington is the most disruptive force in the world. China stands for peace. The United States is eager to use war to solve its geopolitical problems in one region after another. No one can hide away from the hard truth and hard data. That is the world we are faced with. China wants to promote peace. China wants to promote peace with the United States. But if the United States dares to impose war, any kind of war, tariff war, trade war, technological war, Cold War, proxy war, hot war, China will fight back. That's not belligerence. That's the Chinese people's determination to anyone trying to impose war on China.
Mr. Gao, do you agree? I mean, if you ask some of China's neighbours, India comes to mind, would you say that China hasn't provoked any conflict?
China has never provoked a conflict. Even if you look at the 1968
I'm going to ask
clash.
Mr. Abrams to respond to that. My apologies. Go ahead, Mr. Abrams. What do you think about what Dr.
Well,
Gao
I think if China and India have fought, China and India have fought, China and Vietnam have fought. China is today supporting Russian aggression in Ukraine, Putin's war in Ukraine. China is today threatening all of its neighbors in the South China Sea. So I think a peaceful China would not be speaking the way Dr. Gao is speaking today.
Dr. Gao, what do you think about that? We have heard in the news recently about Chinese fighters being captured in Ukraine, fighting for Russia. China may not be there as an official military boots on the ground, but obviously China behind the scenes is lending support.
Come on, China has a population of 1.4 billion people. You have read reports about Chinese nationals fighting on the Ukrainian side, being killed on the battleground. Now you talk about an arrest of a couple of Chinese nationals fighting on the Russian side. I haven't verified all the details, but assume it is true. It is not surprising. The Chinese people have freedom of movement back and forth across the border. And I would not be surprised if there are Chinese nationals fighting either on the Russian side of the war or on the Ukrainian side of the war. This is natural. There are lots of mercenaries, one kind of another, fighting on one side of the war or the other side of the war. If you go to Kyiv, you see national flags of almost 100 countries honoring the dead soldiers killed in the battle. So let's be honest, let's be realistic. We are talking about a war. And you are talking about 1.4 billion people in China. Some love Russia, some love Ukraine. And if, as the American panelist, with due respect, said, if China is really involved in the war, supporting Russia, the war would be over immediately, because no one can fight against the military might of China if China supports the military operations by Russia.
Okay, well, let's turn our attentions to the Middle East then. And let me ask you, Mr. Abrams, first. We have seen China trying to take on a mediating role, bringing together the disparate Palestinian factions to try and get agreement there, to provide a suitable alternative during the peace negotiations. Do you think that the US has languished its role as a global diplomat, and now China has had to pick up that mantle?
No, I think, in fact, the Chinese role in the Middle East has not been particularly strong, neither militarily nor diplomatically. The United States is working now with the new government of Syria, with the new government of Lebanon, working with the Israelis, Palestinians, Jordanians, Egyptians to try to get some kind of peace agreement in Gaza. I think, in fact, China's influence in the Middle East diplomatically and militarily is quite limited.
Dr. Gao, does China have the ability, if you say it wants peace, why hasn't China maybe done more, played more of an active role in trying to mediate the situation in the Middle East?
Well, first of all, everyone knows that China brought the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and Iran together, and they shook hands and they agreed to peaceful coexistence. This is one of the most important breakthroughs in human diplomacy. And I think both countries count on China as a guarantor for that peace accord between Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and Iran. And this actually is a cornerstone of peace and stability for the long run in the Middle East. Now, there is a war involving Gaza, involving parts of West Bank, involving southern Lebanon, involving Syria, etc. China's position is very clear. China always supports the legitimate rights of the Palestinian people. China always demands the two-state solution. China will always oppose very vehemently against any Israeli attempt to seize the land of the Palestinian and to damage and undermine, sabotage the legitimate rights of the Palestinian people. So whatever China is doing as a permanent member state of the United Nations Security Council, as one of the largest economies in the world, is for record of mankind. China is doing the right thing in opposing injustice and violation of the Palestinian people's rights, and China will continue to do that. And in this process, you do not know how many people in the Middle East, for example, the Palestinians, they basically say they can only trust the Chinese. They cannot trust any other country because other countries have their ulterior motives, their own agenda. Talk to the Jordanians, talk to the Lebanese, talk to the Syrians, for example, talk to the Saudis, talk to almost all the Arab countries. They see China as a country without vested interest. And they want to rely on China to achieve the legitimate goal of the Palestinian people. That is their own homeland. That is their own sovereign country. That is becoming a full member state of the United Nations. China is behind all these policy initiatives, and China declares to the world, China is the staunchest supporter of the Palestinian people's legitimate rights.
Mr. Abrams?
Well, first of all, that reading into what Arabs think is something I would never dare to do, and I don't know how Dr. Gao or anybody else can do it, and I think it's false. But with respect to Israel and the Palestinians, it's interesting because China's views, China's rhetoric have risen and fallen. China's relationships with Israel have risen and fallen. They've been closer and more distant. And it has nothing whatsoever to do with China's policy toward the Palestinians. That's completely derivative. What the Chinese have done is move closer to Israel when they thought there'd be maybe some high-tech benefit. Now they've moved further away because they've moved further away because they seem to think that the most important thing is to be on the side against the United States. So if Israel's going to be allied with the United States, they'll drop it. But if you follow the rise and fall of China's relations with Israel and the tone of its rhetoric on the Palestinians, it has nothing to do with Palestinian rights.
Dr. Gao, is there a lack of sincerity to China's actions?
Allow me to. Absolutely not. China has the unique and extraordinary skill of having good constructive relations with Israel on the one hand, as well as with Palestine and all the Arab countries and Muslim countries in the world. China now deals with Israel as it is for those bilateral relations for the mutual benefit of Israel and China, China continues to pursue that. For those actions committed by the Israeli government, Israeli National Defense Force against the legitimate rights of the Palestinian people, China rise up to condemn, regardless of the constructive bilateral relations between China and Israel. Therefore, I think most countries find it puzzling. How can China maintain good relations with Israel on the one hand and be the staunch advocate of the legitimate rights of the Palestinian people on the other hand? That means China does not have a vested interest in this whole war. China supports whichever party which is the right party and condemns whichever party which commits atrocity and denies the people of their legitimate rights. This is what China has been doing for decades, and this will continue to be done by China in the coming decades. China is the strong supporter of the legitimate rights of the Palestinian people from the very beginning till eternity, period.
We're almost out of time, but
I wish you were equally, I just want to say, I wish China was an equally strong supporter of the legitimate rights of the Chinese people, who have no civil and political rights whatsoever under Xi Jinping.
I did want to ask you, though, Mr. Abrams, what did you think about what Dr. Gao said there? Do you think that perhaps China is able to mediate, to have a distinct and special relationship with both sides that the US no longer can because it has a vested interest?
No. China does nothing for the Palestinian people. Take a look, for example, at the aid that it gives the Palestinian people. Pennies, nothing. No, I think it's false. That is, what is China's influence in Syria? Basically none. It's Israel, Turkey, the United States. What is its Syria, Lebanon, the Palestinians? There's actually rhetoric. There's no real influence. When peace is made in Syria, when peace is made in Lebanon, when efforts are made for peace between Israel and the Palestinians, Egypt counts, Jordan counts, the US counts, the EU counts. China these days does not.
Gentlemen, I wish we could continue, but we are out of time. I thank you both for your respectful and insightful comments. Thank you for being part of our panel on Counterpoints. Mr. Elliot Abrams, Republican Presidential National Security Advisor, and Dr. Victor Gao, the Vice President of the Center for China and Globalization. And thank you to you at home for tuning in to Counterpoints with me, Melinda Nucifora. You can catch all our episodes at Al Arabiya English's YouTube channel, and of course follow us on X and TikTok. We'll see you next time.